Borderlands as a franchise is defined by a few major things. The main known one being the impressive amount of different guns. Besides things like the story and missions, the guns you find in Borderlands define your playthrough. And while in your first playthrough, you'll most likely just be taking what you get, there are ways to tailor the experience by having a higher focus on getting the specific gun that works best for your situation. This method comes to us in the form of dedicated drops. Dedicated drops are unique items that have a set chance to drop from a specific enemy. The drop rates vary quite a bit, but the most common to see nowadays is a 10% chance to get the item on kill. Dedicated drops do a lot for Borderlands. They exist as a knowledge check first and foremost, so that after the player realizes that they are indeed a thing, they want to know how many there are and who drops what item. This leads into the next thing they do, which is increase the replayability of the games by a lot. Once the player knows where some of the dedicated drops are, it lets them treat the game in a different way and rewards them with good items for the time they spent learning. But even further beyond that point, once the player knows about almost all of the drops, they can plan their playthroughs to experience some of the more niche facets of the games. As an example, say I'm booting up Borderlands 2 and I pick Krieg. At some point, as I'm leveling up, I decide that I want to try out Krieg's fire skill tree and the surrounding build. Since I know that the build best synergizes with fire, I can focus on the dedicated drops that give me items with a good fire damage over time. This can lead me to seeking out Scorched if I'm a Hellfire SMG, or at the end of that same questline get a Pyrophobia from Incinerator Clayton. From there, you could look to farm a Longbow or Blockhead from the Minecraft Easter egg in Caustic Caverns, then closer to the endgame, branch off to the many different options of guns that can come in any element. And that's just one example. Being able to earn the guns that you know fit your situation best makes the player feel so free with their choices, tailoring how their playthrough eventually feels. So since I personally find dedicated drops so important to Borderlands, I want to go over their history and how their absence from the games could only hurt the franchise. So what's going on? I'm Cashew, and this is the history of dedicated drops in Borderlands. Dedicated drops were flat out not a factor in Borderlands 1, at least not in the same way they are today. Throughout the game, there are very few items that do have a dedicated source, with most legendaries mainly received as world drops, meaning gotten from chests and whatnot. In the base game, outside of hybrids, the only dedicated drops are uniques, not legendaries, with most of these uniques actually being an alternative way to regain quest rewards after their quest is completed. This consists of guns like the Dove from Slither, the Leviathan from Rackhive, TK's Wave from Scar, and the Elephant Gun from Skagzilla. There are also a few dedicateds from certain story bosses, but these are also different in the way that they are all guaranteed to drop. Guns like the Clipper from Nine Toes, Sledge's Shotgun, the Boomstick from Flint, the Roaster from Taylor Cobb, the Meat Grinder from Janus Cobb, Crom's Sidearm, and the Bone Shredder from Bonehead all fit under this. The 100% chance drops also spread to some quest bosses, like One-Eyed Jack always dropping the Mad Jack, or Reaver always dropping the Reaver's Edge. Moving on to the actual dedicated farms that aren't a guaranteed drop in Borderlands 1's base game, we have none. Every unique drop in Borderlands 1 base game is guaranteed. The only ones that require a farm are the quest rewards. Uniques that aren't consist of King Wee Wee Super Booster, one of only 2 unique shields in the base game. It gives the player 15% health boost while also having passive health regen. The other shield is the Cracked Sash, dropping from Rakanishu. This one's a lot less unique as it's just a decent ancient shield with faster than average recharge. The only other dedicated from the base game I find worth mentioning is the Rider, because of its very unique circumstances. Once you defeat Taylor Cobb, you immediately are directed into going to the Trash Coast to defeat the Rackhive in the next story mission, another piece of the puzzle. Most players, since they're already there, would just rush to the boss and then return to the hub later. But during this quest specifically, for some reason, if you go back to New Haven and come to this area behind the main buildings, you'll be able to activate an elevator that takes you to a hidden basement. Inside, you'll find a chest, and in it, there is the Rider as a Christmas Story Easter egg. At this point in the franchise history, dedicated drops were not something that was ever thought about. But as with a lot of things in this franchise, that would change with the release of the General Knox DLC. This DLC did so much for this franchise. It was a huge sign that the story and villains were becoming more complex, as well as making the main villain talking directly to the player through the whole adventure a mainstay. In the way of dedicated drops though, they had a few new ones. For continuing the guaranteed unique on kill trend from the base game and the Kairos Power, the Typhoon, and the Ajax, all dropping from the commanders of the same name, plus the final boss, General Knox, also drops the Knox's Gold every time. But while we've seen this kind of drop before, the Knox DLC was the first place where we would see dedicated drops as they are today. After driving to the Sunken Sea, you can meet an NPC named Thirsty. After you do his first side quest for him, they'll ask you to track down and kill a boss called Motorhead, who is Sledge from the base game after a bunch of bandits got a hold of his body and turned him into a machine. Motorhead has a 5% chance to drop the unique gun, the Chopper. When firing the gun once, it will shoot out its entire mag insanely fast. Besides from pearls dropping only from Craw and Lance chests, context, this was the only dedicated drop in the franchise that you actually had to farm. But it wouldn't be the only one for long. The launch of Borderlands 2 was almost the opposite of how Borderlands 1 handled it in the way of dedicated drops. Borderlands 2 had a lot more than one, and had the focus specifically on the legendaries. However, this was still far from where we are today, as at Borderlands 2's launch in 2012, dedicated drops did exist, but had a much lower 3.33% chance to drop. This was later tripled after Gearbox hosted different drop rate experiments every week from April 9th to May 13th in 2015. In this 5-week period, players would test out different drop rates, then submit their feedback through the old Gearbox forums and surveys. A quote from the announcement post Gearbox made states, "We discovered that standard drop rates were perceived as too rare, but anything over a 3x boost felt like too much. Almost to the point where it was starting to take away from the challenge and excitement from seeing that beautiful orange glow." That last part of the quote will sound pretty interesting to some when comparing it to where the series is today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The drop rates were permanently tripled on May 26, 2015, making most legendaries with a source a 10% drop chance. For me personally, this is the perfect drop chance. It still makes you work for your drops by farming, but you're never doing it for too long unless you're supremely unlucky. Borderlands 2 does do dedicated drops the best in my opinion, especially after the buff. This is where all the stuff I mentioned at the top of the video comes into play. Replayability skyrockets, player interaction with the in-game world increases, and just gives the player yet another reason and way to play. Almost every legendary at launch had a drop source, so it'd actually be easier for me to name the ones that don't. These are the Shredder Fire, which did eventually get a drop source in a DLC from the raid boss Hyperius. Then we have the Fire Bee and the Bouncing Bonnie. That's it. Honestly, a massive achievement to have almost all legendary unique items have a specific drop source that the player can seek out. Borderlands 2 remains the gold standard of how to handle dedicated drops in Borderlands, which is why it is so frustrating that the series refuses to follow it. Going back 1 year to 2014, Borderlands the pre-sequel released, and with it, not too many dedicateds, I'll tell you that much. Pre-sequel's launch was just flat out odd for dedicated drops, as even though the Borderlands 2 drops were still low at this time, at least they were like there, able to be farmed. Pre-sequel took it in a different direction by having dedicated drops, but not having the bosses that dropped them respawn. The only bosses that did respawn were those from the story, like Deadlift, Bosun, Felicity, and RK5, the latter of which's drops are broken, can't drop, and still has not been fixed to this day. This meant the only way to traditionally farm an item from a non-story boss was to go into your game's files, change your game's save properties to read-only, so that the game wouldn't save, and then you could farm over and over. This only works on PC though, so console players would have to exit out of their game on kill and reboot the whole game for every run. This clearly was not ideal, and fans didn't like it at all. You might be wondering, why is it like this? And that is because of the grinder, an exclusive mechanic to the pre-sequel. If you put a specific combination of items into the grinder, you could get legendaries out of it. The most seen recipe for this being 2 legendaries, then a purple gun of the gun type you want out of it. This caused players to absolutely abuse the one drop that wasn't complete arse, being the thingy from Iwajira. Iwajira is a secret boss found in the first main map of the game inside a volcano. They're usually pretty hard to defeat, being the reason that their drop was so high. But of course, once players got on level for the fight and had much better builds, Iwajira was no slower to farm than any other boss. You know, if they existed. This meta was so overused that Gearbox actually nerfed the thingy's drop rate so people would have to farm other places if they wanted to use the grinder. But now it felt like pre-sequel players had nowhere to go. With extremely low amounts of dedicateds and no outright fast way to get grinder food, most guns fell out of reach and people stopped playing. Thankfully though, the pre-sequel players would catch a break on March 24th, 2015, where the Claptastic Voyage DLC released, but more importantly to us with it was an update that finally made farmable bosses farmable. The bosses fixed were the Tiny Destroyer, who drops the Moonlight Saga Oz kit, Boomer, who drops the Kaboom, Rabbit Adams, who drops the unique The Malak's Mouth, the Giant Struggler of Ice, who drops the Zim, Bruce, who drops the Supernova Shield, Rooster Booster, who drops the Oxidizer Oz kit, Even More Disgusting Torque, who drops the Flacker, Tony Slows, who drops nothing, I don't know why they let him respawn, Drongo Bones, who drops the Fatale, Meg, who drops the Torrent, the Claplek, who was able to respawn before to farm the Eddie Oz kit, but only if you chose to seal the Claplek inside the room during its side quest. The update made it so that you could farm it twice in one run by this method, since they now respawn earlier in the map and at the old location. There was also the Lost Legion Power Suit noob, who drops the Shooting Star Shield, Meathead, who drops the unique The Meat Grinder, and finally Zarpedon, who still does not respawn due to the map she appears in getting closed off during the story, so her loot pool was instead added to the final boss of the campaign, the Sentinel, including both the ZX1 and the Prismatic Bulwark Shield. This was a major victory for the community, though some of the bosses were still quite time wasty. I think the biggest example of this is Bruce, Bruce and Boomer, who I mentioned before, they both still do respawn after completing their side quests, but only after you fight 2 waves of enemies at their spawn location first. Huge shame for Bruce in particular, since legendary shields are so hard to come by, especially if you're looking to use them for grinder food. Bosses now respawned, which was awesome, but the drop rates were still really low. And this is where we made up with the BL2 side of things, as on May 26, 2015, drop rates were tripled, and most dedicated drops had either a 5 or 10% drop chance. Most of them being 5 sadly, which is still a little too low for my taste, especially in pre-sequels economy, where you're kind of looking to farm multiple versions of the same guns used for grinder food. But at least the lesson was learned, and dedicated drops would remain a mainstay for the rest of the series. Right? No, actually. Pre-sequels dedicateds were far from the standard set by Borderlands 2 still, and a lot of legendaries were left on the table that fans weren't really happy about. Enter Borderlands 3. BL3 did have dedicated drops at launch, but not for every legendary, because I mean, there are a lot of legendaries in that game. Honestly, I think they still did pretty well for how many they had at launch, but as a fan, it is incredibly disappointing to not see every legendary had a place to get it. Not that that necessarily mattered in Borderlands 3, because the world drop rates for legendaries were massive compared to previous games. This led to players finding one boss to farm over and over and over again, being the Grave Ward, until that eventually got nerfed, very similar to the Thingy situation. Even so, I would actually be stunned if you played through all of Borderlands 3 normally and didn't encounter at least a few legendaries. This stands in pretty humorous contrast to the quote I read out a bit ago, where they didn't want drops to feel less exciting by having the dedicateds over 10%, especially since most dedicateds in Borderlands 3 are around 10 to 15%. Thanks to fan outcry, we actually eventually did get every legendary as a dedicated. This massive update arrived with the Maliwan Takedown and Mayhem 4 expansion on November 21st, 2019. The only catch was that since there were so many legendaries, they had to double up the loot pool for quite a few of them. This made it a lot harder to farm a specific gun, since other legendaries you might not have been going for might drop instead, crowding up the loot pool. Nevertheless, I do appreciate that they did commit to it anyway, as it is better now than it was at launch. Throughout the game's lifespan though, it was quite annoying to keep up with, as drop sources for certain legendaries would change pretty frequently. But thankfully through these updates, we received new dedicated drops added into the game with Mayhem 6 exclusive guns, and the new campaign DLCs all having their own dedicateds, also without crowded loot pools. Dedicated drops had finally fully implemented themselves into the series and had become a mainstay. So you already know that they learned the lesson for the next game. No again. The next game to release was Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and it followed the exact same annoying pattern that Borderlands 3 did. At launch, there were many dedicated drops, but a lot were missing, presumably so they could keep the best legendary farm committing to the game's endgame, the Chaos Chamber, a dungeon gauntlet that lets you spend the crystals you earned during it to give you a mountain of guaranteed legendaries of a specific type. But surprise, surprise, the fans didn't do that, and instead opted to abuse the Zomboss fight for legendaries to the point where it had to be nerfed. Where have I seen this before? So, again, fans weren't happy about this, because of course they weren't. We'd already been through the song and dance twice at this point. So again, fan uproar convinced Gearbox to add in more dedicated drops in a later patch. Dedicated drops should be in the game at launch, full stop. We shouldn't need to wait for a patch for them to add the half they didn't get to beforehand. And that's why I wanted to make this retrospective in particular. Dedicated drops have been a much more important aspect of hardcore Borderlands than it's really given credit for, and it would be a shame if we ever lost the focus on them when they can help enhance your playthrough to such a high extent. All in all, I personally hope that dedicated drops are fully included in future Borderlands games, from legendaries to even bringing back how Borderlands 1 handled it with its quest rewards. There is a lot to learn from the history here, and it would be a shame if some of this got forgotten to time. But let me know in the comments what your opinion on dedicated drops are, because I know they can be pretty divisive. But thank you all so much for making it this far in the video. You owe me nothing more, and I really appreciate you. Thank you for watching, and let's do the channel member shoutouts. My channel members are JBH, who can communicate with carrots, and they are just in pain constantly. It is a cursed existence, I'll tell you what. Wesker520, who knows the secret knock to the bank vault. The tellers hear it and they just have to let him in. Angel B, who haggles so well that people pay them to have their product. Jimby Scrimpy, who has Santa powers. They see everyone when they're sleeping, and if they can't see you, well, they know you're awake then, don't they? Jake Nate, who runs an underground polar bear fight ring. I don't know if you ever played Spyro 3, but it's kind of like that. Noah Roland, who is friends with everyone, so all conflicts cease to be upon them entering the room. Handsome Frank 63, who is a master at holding throwing knives. It is a cruel world. Tryptophan, who survived Snake Gulch. I'd love to tell you how it happens, but by law, what happens in Snake Gulch kind of stays in Snake Gulch. Death, who is distantly related to mole people. Lucky. Nevertheless Raven, who is more than your average philanthropist. They donate other people's money. Sort of like a messed up Peter Pan situation where they rob normal people to help the poor. Koi Cadaver, who can eat 7 whales worth of food with only a spork and a dream. And Tree of Aspen, who is so naturally pure that every time a witch tries to put a curse on them, it reflects right off. It's a big problem in their part of the world. But thank you all so much. Like, so much for the extra support. You are all amazing. And if you want to shout out at the end of every video like this, then the join button is just below the video there. But one last time, thank you so much for watching. Sub if you can, and I'll see you in the next one.